Oliver Hartwich from the NZ Initiative is my special guest today. Now, there's a reason why I'm having Oliver on the show, and there's a reason why I've been exploring lately the bigger picture aspects of investing on the podcast. 2020 showed us that many investors could have safely ignored some basic fundamentals around investing, but I'm not convinced that 2021 will let us off so easily. What this means is that we should consider impacts of things like debt, how new money is created, and some of the longer-term risks and opportunities that inflation poses, or the loss of value that our currency can hold. I'm especially interested in the potential positive and negative impacts that modern monetary theory could have going forward for the everyday investor also. So before we go on, a little bit of jargon busting. I quickly want to define before we start what the debt to GDP actually means. We talk about it in today's show, but we didn't really define it. By comparing what a country owes with what it produces, the debt to GDP ratio reliably indicates that particular country's ability to pay back its debts. This ratio is often expressed as a percentage. Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of 234%. Greece is around 181%, and New Zealand is set to hit around 50% in the next couple of years. The US, for comparison, by the way, is likely already at 100% and growing, just to give you some perspective. Now, GDP is the monetary value of all the finished goods and services produced in a country in a specific time period. It's not entirely accurate for me to make this comparison, but simplistically, you could think of GDP as a proxy for personal household income. So if you were to think about this from a household's perspective, many homeowners that I talk with will have a debt to income ratio of around 400 to 600%. Their debt, including their mortgage, is likely around 4 to 6 times what their annual income is. The higher this ratio is, the less likely there's capacity to borrow more in the future. It also means you're more exposed to shocks like loss of income and rising interest rates. Now, for some, it's not always a bad thing to have a high debt to income ratio, especially if there's confidence around some sort of strategy to repay the debt, either through income increasing or the sale of some assets in the future. For governments, however, unless there is some spare capacity in the economy to increase GDP, there's a risk of a potential default on the debt, which in theory could cause widespread financial panic. While New Zealand is in an enviable position currently, our debt to GDP figure is likely going to increase. Now, when you throw in modern monetary theory also into the mix, or the belief that any country who can issue its own currency can simply print their way out of trouble, you start to see a picture of disturbed waters ahead. I talk frequently about how building wealth in the new world requires new tools and new strategies. If there's transformation coming, some will be victims of it and some will be victors. It all depends on which side of the change that you're positioned in. In 2021, we may see two groups of investors starting to emerge. Traditionalists, who insist that mainstream investment ideology is what we'll eventually revert back to, and the alt investors, those who believe we're heading into significant disruption, the likes we haven't seen since the Great Depression. So, what is the New Zealand Initiative and who is Oliver Hartwich? Well, the NZ Initiative is a pro-free market public policy think tank and business membership organization in New Zealand. It was formed in 2012 by the merger of the NZBR, or the New Zealand Business Roundtable, and the New Zealand Institute. The initiative's main areas of focus include housing, education, and overseas investment. Economist Oliver Hartwich has been the executive director of the NZ Initiative since its formation in 2012. So the NZ Everyday Investor is brought to you in partnership with Hatch. Now, Hatch has provided a special link in the notes that if you click on that and you're a new account holder, you deposit $100 or more into your new Hatch account, you'll get a $20 credit for free. So if you like today's show, be sure to like it, share it, and subscribe. Let's begin. So today we're going to have a conversation around a few things, but just to get started and just to introduce our audience to what the NZ Initiative is, can you just explain what it is and what you guys do, what role you perform in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. We are a think tank and we're also a business membership organization. That means we work on public policy issues like housing, like education, even fisheries management, fiscal policy, monetary policy, anything really under the sun as far as policy is concerned, but we are also a business membership organization. So we are funded by currently a bit more than 70 companies, typically the large end of town, but we are working as a think tank, not as a lobby group. And there's a massive difference. So we're working on the issues that will make the country better in the long run. We're not working on the issues that are just in the interest of our members. We actually try to make this a country that will be a better country for everyone, including the members, but not predominantly for the members.
Got it. And that's a really important thing. And that was probably one of the things that I thought when I was approaching you guys. I just thought, is this just some sort of organization which pushes the agenda of individual members and their own things that they want to accomplish? But no, it's clear that it's for New Zealand. It's trying to lift the game by providing, I guess, a different voice that you might not necessarily hear or even agree with, but it's designed to get a conversation going, isn't it?
That's exactly right. It's sometimes difficult for me when I'm talking to new members or potential members and they ask me, so what's in it for me? And I say, honestly, nothing, because we're not working for you, we're working for the country, and you should support us because you want to support New Zealand. That is not the easiest sales pitch, I must tell you, but when members come on board and they see what we do and they get our publications and they see what an impact we have, they stay on board and they become enthusiastic members over time. But initially you think, well, why would I join a business membership organization that doesn't actually work for business, but works for the country?
Just to get a flavor of what the NZ initiative is all about, what the values are, what kind of policies are you a proponent of?
Well, we started 8 years ago in 2012, and we started with just 3 topics at the time. And these topics are still with us until the present day. We started with housing affordability because even in 2012, we could already see it is a big problem for New Zealand because a lot of New Zealanders will struggle to get a foot onto the property ladder because our housing market is so inflated. That hasn't really changed. In fact, it's become worse, and we've been working on this for 8 years, and we've got some ideas on how to fix this housing market. The other issue that's been with us from the beginning is education, because again, back in 2012, it was already quite clear that New Zealand has some problems in the education system. And again, these problems have probably only become worse in the last 8 years. We only just recently got data from the new TIM study. That's a study looking into mathematics and science education in New Zealand schools, where we were shown again to trail the international average, and we are miles behind some Asian countries like Singapore when it comes to teaching our kids at school. And the third issue at the time, still relevant today, overseas investment. New Zealand is one of the countries with the highest barriers to overseas investment. And we have pointed out consistently over the years why that is a problem, because we are not playing our role in international value chains. And unfortunately, the restrictiveness of the overseas investment regime is one of the issues that's really holding New Zealand back.
For today, what I'd like to do now is maybe just have a look at the macroeconomic environment internationally through a New Zealand perspective. So from the perspective of an everyday investor based in New Zealand, looking at some of the things that are happening overseas as a result of this health crisis, which turned into an economic crisis, what are some of the themes that you're seeing roll out and play out right now overseas?
Well, this is a crisis of a kind that we've never had before. I just recently heard about Britain, for example. Britain is probably experiencing its worst recession in more than 300 years. So this is not your kind of run-of-the-mill recession that you have now and then. It's a crisis with severe implications, both on the labor market in many countries, but also and certainly on public finances. It is also a crisis that is speeding up quite a few other developments. For example, we've been in this environment of extremely low interest rates and sometimes negative interest rates, and this crisis has actually emphasized that. So what I see internationally is that we are now in this basically no yield environment where all central banks around the world have actually flooded the market with even more money, with freshly printed money and quantitative easing. And this is going to be one of the big structural macroeconomic challenges for the next few decades, how to deal with this amount of money that's now sweeping through the markets, and also how to deal with the corresponding level of government debt, which has reached astronomical levels in many countries. I mean, think of Italy. Italy will finish the year on 160% debt to GDP. Typically, you would have said at these levels, countries are about to go bankrupt. We'll probably have to get used to dealing with higher levels of government debt in the future. The question is, how high can they be until the system falls over?
Then that's a good question. So like on that, and taking Italy as an example, I know you wrote a piece recently, which I think I saw in the New Zealand Herald around Italy, or their version of what could ultimately result in maybe even an Italian Brexit from the EU. Do you want to just talk to me a little bit about the dynamics that's playing out in Europe right now specifically?
Yes, well, that goes back to my work as a columnist for many years for the Australian Business Spectator, and I became a columnist at the time of the Euro crisis. So I think for my sins, I've written about 300 columns about the problem that is the euro, and I always argued that Europe wasn't ready for it, that monetary union wasn't working, and Italy is one of those countries where you could actually see why it wasn't working, because basically from the moment the euro was introduced until the present day, Italy has not improved its economy. Actually, industrial output is lower today in Italy than it was at the time of the euro's introduction. And when this corona crisis started earlier in the year, I predicted in a column for Newsroom that was in early March this year that Italy would be one of the main victims of this corona crisis. The reason why I argued that was because already at the time, Italy was at 135% debt to GDP. Italy was heavily tourism dependent. So about, I think it was 11 or 12% of the Italian economy is tourism. And of course, that's one of the sectors most affected by the COVID crisis. And so what I predicted back in March was that by the end of the year, we might get to maybe 150% to GDP, and then we'll have to discuss whether Italy can actually sustain itself within the euro system, or whether at some stage it might want to reconsider its position, because obviously after 2 decades of experience of dealing with monetary union in Europe, it is clear that this euro doesn't work for Italy. And this is roughly where we are now. So I revisited the issue in another column for Newsroom just recently and had a look what happened in the meantime. And the stunning effect is actually that Italy will now reach 160% debt to GDP, so even worse than I predicted in March. And that's partially because Italy has taken on more debt, obviously, to fight the crisis, but it's also because the denominator, so GDP, has fallen so much in Italy that as a percentage, debt to GDP has gone up to 160.
Right. So the stuff on the top, the stuff on the bottom have both changed, which exacerbate it. Yeah.
Indeed. The other thing on top of that is, of course, what's happening in monetary policy. Just to have a look at the balance sheet of the Banca d'Italia, Italy's central bank, they added about a third to the balance sheet. And a large chunk of that is, of course, the Bank of Italy now holding Italian government debt like never before. So more than 500 billion euros of Italian government bonds now on the balance sheet of the Banca d'Italia. This is unprecedented. The other thing is, of course, Italy has a fragile banking system. So what started under Mario Draghi when he was president of the European Central Bank was that the ECB basically provided cash free of charge to the Italian banking system. And the idea was that the banks would then lend it on to the Italian government and buy Italian government bonds, maybe at 1 or 2% yield, and pocket the difference. So in this one operation, the ECB achieved 2 targets. They kept the Italian government afloat because they provided buyers for their bonds, and at the same time, they provided a windfall to the Italian banking system, which was teetering. And so this policy is continuing, and I saw on the balance sheet of the Banca d'Italia that they added about a bit more than 100 billion of direct bond holdings of Italian government bonds, plus another more than 100 billion of lending to the Italian banking system to help them buy government bonds as well. And the whole thing is, of course, totally unsustainable, because how and where will this end?
I guess probably one of my next questions, but just to break this down for our audience a little bit more, am I correct in assuming that another way of actually framing this dynamic, which is, Italy is a pretty good example of this, but it's happening in a lot of other countries as well. Effectively, there's just a bunch of IOUs, right? They're kind of just sitting there, just bits of paper. Yeah, we'll pay you back. But what happens when they either cannot or they decide that they just don't want to pay it back? What happens then?
Well, that would be the end of the euro, because the construction of the euro, of course, depended on everybody playing by the rules. Now, that never really happened, as we know. But at some stage, I think other European countries simply wouldn't want to put up with that anymore. The problem with that is that there is this little-known mechanism called Target 2, which kind of glues Europe together because no one can afford to let the system blow up. I'm not sure whether you've covered Target 2 before.
No, I haven't. Please do, though. I'd really love an explanation as to what it is. So go
okay.
ahead.
In my view, Target 2 is actually the biggest black hole in international finance. The European Central Bank has a clearing mechanism. That doesn't sound too exciting. It's just a system that helps shift money around the euro system from bank to bank, from one central bank to another central bank, all within the euro system. And typically in these clearing systems, of course, you don't build up balances. It's just to channel money from one place to another. What's happened in Europe since 2007 is that they have actually used the system to provide credit to countries that couldn't access capital markets anymore. And so, give you a practical example, if you were a Greek farmer, for example, you were trying to buy a new tractor from Germany. Typically, what you would have to do is you go to your bank, you ask for a loan so you can buy the tractor, the bank refinances itself, gives you the loan, the money gets transferred to the German producer of the tractor, the Greek farmer gets the tractor, and everybody's happy. In 2007, what happened was, of course, capital markets didn't want to lend to Greek banks anymore. And so the Greek central bank stepped in. They created the euros that the commercial bank in Greece needed to pay as a loan to the Greek farmer. And in that sense, the money was still transferred back to Germany, so the tractor could be exported, but the money was created out of thin air in Greece. And for that money, the German Bundesbank got a credit against the euro system. And now I ask you just to speculate with me how much these claims are now worth for Germany, for example, after 13 years of that system playing out. It's more than €1 trillion. More than €1 trillion are sitting in this clearance mechanism, which was never supposed to carry any balances. And that brings me back to your earlier question. The thing is, what happens when the system blows up? The thing is, when the system blows up and Germany, for example, decided to leave the euro system because it no longer wants to provide credit to the others, well, Germany would never be able to recoup its €1 trillion. And the German central bank, the Bundesbank, would have to be recapitalized by €1 trillion. Well, it's impossible, of course. Or if the debtor countries leave, so if the Italies and Greeces of this world leave that system, they would, of course, just walk away from it and say, well, that's very nice that you gave us all of money and thank you very much, but you don't really seriously expect us to find capital now to pay you out. So in that sense, the system is a problem because as long as the euro system keeps together, these are just claims on paper. As soon as it breaks up, the problem actually starts because then we'll talk about recapitalizing the whole European banking and central banking system.
Right. So effectively, the dike is being plugged up with a whole bunch of thumbs waiting, but there's a massive storm that's building. The water level is building. At some stage, things are gonna get messy, and it means that it'll either be the death of the euro, maybe there's some sort of forgiveness of debt, like a debt jubilee event. What are we gonna see next? Do you have any idea?
Impossible to predict. Different European countries have different ideas. So the Italians are now talking quite openly about debt forgiveness. They would like to see their debt just cancelled. The argument is, well, it's on the book of the central bank anyway. We can just take it off. The central bank cancels the debt and we just continue as we were before. Ironically, it's the French government that doesn't like the idea because the French are arguing, no, there are some rules for monetary union and it would be far better to just amend the rules. So we have jointly issued bonds, the so-called euro bonds. And in that way, they try to let the Germans, for example, or the Dutch guarantee for French borrowing. But that wouldn't work if we just continue this path of giving more loans to individual governments and then canceling the debt. And the Germans, meanwhile, they don't want either. They don't want to see debt cancellation, but they don't want to see jointly guaranteed bonds either. The whole thing is a complete disaster. The COVID crisis has sped it up. At some stage, the Europeans will have to find a way to actually make this system sustainable because for the past 10 years at least, so basically since the GFC and the euro crisis, they've only really papered over the cracks.
Sounds like great news, isn't it? This is sounding pretty optimistic. So let's head across the Atlantic and we'll find some better outcomes and some better stories over there. So let's talk about Trump and Biden, if we can. And each one of those leaders, I guess you could say, would potentially have a stimulatory effect on equity markets to some degree. Like the share markets were going pretty well under Trump, and then as soon as the news of Biden came out, then things seem to take off again. So I can't quite figure it out, but is Biden or Trump better for markets? What would you say to that?
Well, I had a column on that one too, actually, recently in the Herald, comparing the economic policy settings under Trump to the policy promises from Biden. My conclusion was actually that they were both pretty bad when it comes to economic management. I mean, if you look at Trump, if you give me a few billion or trillion dollars to stimulate the economy and run deficits, I can create you a very nice economic success story too. It's just not sustainable. And that's roughly what Trump did over his 4 years in office. So he pushed the Federal Reserve into lower interest rates. He spent money basically like a Keynesian deficit spender. He gave tax cuts. He had extra spending initiatives. He ran massive deficits. It's not difficult to get an economy stimulated with these measures, but as I said, it's not sustainable. So Trump's policies were, I think, relatively disastrous. He did some good things on the deregulation front, but on traditional tax and spend policies and deficit policies, I think that was not sustainable. Now, Biden, by contrast, will probably or would like to do this even harder. The problem for Biden is, of course, that he will not command a majority in the Senate. The Senate is needed, though, for spending initiatives, and therefore I think Biden's options are a bit more limited when it comes to further fiscal stimulus. But as I said, neither of the two is a dream candidate from an economically liberal perspective, because both rely heavily on tax, borrow, and spend policies.
So, with Trump, it was quite overt. It was quite clear what he was doing, the mechanism that he was using to make things happen. Whereas Biden, it's probably aligned in terms of the tools they want to use, but the process in getting it out there might be a bit impeded, right?
Yes. There's one thing positive you can say about Biden, and that is, I think we will probably see a return to a more free trade agenda. Biden is not a complete free trader by any definition, but if you compare what we've had under Trump, of course, where the World Trade Organization was basically cancelled by him, by his refusal to appoint more judges to WTO tribunals, by his imposition of punitive tariffs, even on his European allies. We will not see that under Biden. I think we'll probably see a repair of the multilateral global international order under Biden. So that can only be a good thing for globalization.
From a New Zealand perspective, investing in the US, could you just unpack that partnership agreement a little bit more? Because I'm just thinking in terms of where China is at in particular. Is there maybe an opportunity for New Zealand to enhance our connection to the US so that we get more trade coming there? Is that kind of what you see happening as a positive outcome?
At least that's my hope. We shouldn't forget, of course, when it came to the negotiations that led to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Americans were initially part of the game. They were part of the negotiations. They were not the easiest negotiation partner, of course, but then they pulled out just before the 2016 election because the whole thing proved to be too unpopular in the US. Now time has passed. This trade agreement has been established. Maybe there is a chance to bring the Americans back on board, especially now that we have another free trade agreement, which we passed 2 weeks ago, which actually integrates a lot of Asian and Pacific countries, including China. So I think it would be worth another push with the Americans under Biden.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk a little bit about the tool that has been used, or the theory that's been kind of pushed forward a little bit. I've been keen to talk this through a little bit more, and you've kind of loosely touched on this already. Modern monetary theory. What is that, if you can define that for us to start with?
Well, as the name suggests, it is neither modern nor monetary nor theory. It is a misnomer. So there's nothing modern about it because the idea is actually quite old. The ideas are that you can print your way to prosperity. You give it to central banks and say, can you please just provide us a bit more cash, and we'll spend that money for you, and we, meaning the government. So it is not modern. It's been there. We've seen it actually in Weimar Germany in the 1920s. We've seen it in Venezuela. We've seen it in Zimbabwe. The idea that central banks can just print your way to prosperity, it doesn't work. So nothing modern about it. Actually, nothing monetary about it either, because this is a fiscal prescription. The idea is that government can spend more if the central bank just provides it some extra cash. In that sense, it actually blurs the lines between monetary and fiscal, and effectively it really becomes a fiscal policy prescription where government should just spend a lot more. And theory, well, it's not really backed up by great economic theory from what I can tell. I've seen a devastating review of the book recently in one of the big American economic journals. It is more a practice prescription. It's a political prescription. It's an ideology that dresses up as a great monetary theory. And in fact, there's relatively little actually backing it up.
So if we were to think about how monetary policy works, then we look at fiscal policy, obviously increasing taxes, spending less. That's not necessarily going to get you a lot of votes. Whereas printing more money, getting more money out there in the system as a way just to kind of almost achieve short-term objectives of what doing that could achieve. I guess that's politically a little bit more palatable. Is that why we're seeing the rise of this practice, is because it's politically palatable?
Yes, because it promises you a sugar rush. Whenever a central bank engages in aggressive monetary policy, printing money and effectively handing it over to governments, of course the economy will be stimulated. It is just incredibly dangerous in the long run because it is not sustainable. And as I said, we've been there before, and we have actually been there since the 1970s at speed. 1971 was the year when Richard Nixon finally moved the US off the last bits of the gold standard. And ever since, we've been in this fiat money world where central banks can create as much cash as they like, but the results we've seen. So we've had many more crises since the 1970s than we've witnessed in history. I mean, we had this big stock market crash in 87. We had the Asian crisis in the late 1990s. We had the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. We had the GFC, and now we have the Corona crisis with all the additional monetary tools being deployed. All of these crises had one thing in common. They are always getting bigger. Every crisis is bigger now than the one that precedes it. And these crises, I think, are also becoming more frequent over time. The reason being is actually that it doesn't work that way, monetary policy-wise. And I actually belong to a small school in the School of Economics, and that's the Austrian school. Yeah. Austrian economics has long warned actually against this kind of monetary activism, monetary interventionism. And if you go back to the writings of Friedrich Hayek in the 1970s, where he argued for a denationalization of money, what he meant was taking government's control away of the money supply because it's too dangerous. Because whenever government has access to money and monetary policy, the temptation will always be there to abuse monetary policy and actually stimulate the economy, provide some cash to the government. But ultimately, this will destroy the value of money. And, you know, the long-term function of money is, of course, as a kind of store of value and as a means of exchange. But you're really working against these two fundamental functions of money if you basically abuse it as a political tool.
So it's too close, right? Like separation of the church and state, separation of the central bank and the government. It's starting to get too close again, isn't it? And it's not that we're trying to protect those institutions, it's not like we're trying to protect the government from the institutions. That's the other way around, right? Like what you're saying. So what's the potential outcome here if this persists? Like, I'm just looking at the property market, the equity markets. They're a giant sponge. They've been potentially soaking up a lot of this extra currency, right? Am I correct in viewing it like that? Like it's a giant pimple waiting to be popped, basically?
Yes, that's the way I see it. And there are logical limits to that kind of policy. I mean, for last 20, 30 years, we have witnessed this global decline in interest rates. Now, some central bankers will tell you it's just because we've got a savings glut and people don't know where to put their money, and that's what's driving down interest rates. I think actually what's happening is something completely different. It's just that central banks are inflating the money supply. You can see this actually if you just track what's happened to M1, for example, under the Federal Reserve, or if you just have a look at how much money central banks have added to their balance sheets. Look at how much how inflated the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and now the New Zealand Reserve Bank, of course, has become. The end game here is that these policies will run out because we cannot drive down interest rates much more. I mean, they're already at zero or negative in large parts of the world. Yes, you can use quantitative easing to drive yields down even further, but at some stage this will come to an end. And when that comes to an end, I think this whole system might actually implode because of its inherent contradictions. And that would not be pretty because it would trigger a banking crisis. It would create a crisis of trust. People would no longer trust money. They would want to hold some other assets. And we can already see that, of course. They would probably try to get into stocks. They would try to get into gold as a physical safe harbor value. But at some stage, I think government will then try to stop that and introduce capital controls, prohibit holding gold, for example. We can already see that. So I'm quite concerned about the long-term sustainability of this fiat money system.
Is it a symptom of the system dying? Like, well, I guess what I'm thinking of is, we have a health crisis that leads to an economic crisis. The crisis logically that comes from that is kind of what you touched on before, but it's kind of like a crisis of institutions, isn't it? Where we lose faith in the competence or the ability or the trustworthiness in institutions, whether it be the financial systems that we trust or even the government. So we're talking about a pretty slippery slope here in terms of how this could progress, right?
Yes, and institutional quality matters hugely, and trust in institutions matters hugely. And I can say that as a German, I come from a country that has experienced two hyperinflations in the 20th century, first in the Weimar Republic, and then after the Second World War. In each case, German savers lost practically all their savings to inflation because in the 1920s, the mark became worthless and there was hyperinflation. I mean, really millions of percentage points of inflation. And then after the Second World War, the old Reichsmark, of course, was worthless too. So having been burned by two hyperinflations really over the course of just about 30, 40 years, the Germans decided to give themselves an independent central bank, the Bundesbank, tasked it with just maintaining price stability. And it actually worked. It worked really well until the introduction of the euro, to the point that when the euro was introduced, they had to promise to make it as sound as the mark and gave the European Central Bank complete independence and just one target, price stability. As we know now, of course, the others in Europe were not playing by the rules, and actually the Germans themselves were not playing by the rules anymore once the euro was introduced. And so we can see this decline in institutional quality and trust in institutions. We can see the same in New Zealand, by the way.
I know, that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about, because that's obviously been in the media recently. And I think it's just, it's so fascinating to see how the narrative have skirted around the core issue here, which is the Reserve Bank's independence. So like it's happening here, isn't it? This is the kind of like the beginning of that.
It is totally happening. The first thing is, of course, that the government changed the Reserve Bank's target. So previously it was just maintaining price stability, which makes good sense, which is exactly what a central bank should be doing. Even though I thought the target range, 1 to 3% inflation, was too high, for my taste it should rather be 0 to 2. And I wouldn't even hold the bank too much to account if they're undershooting the target. I would just rather insist on having an upper target that they shouldn't actually exceed. But what's also happening to the Reserve Bank is, of course, we have a very interventionist-minded Reserve Bank governor now in Adrian Orr. And what irritated me a lot about Adrian Orr is that over the last 2 years, he has engaged himself in political debates which really shouldn't have anything to do with him. So when Adrian Orr told the government that he would like to spend more on infrastructure and the government should borrow more to spend on infrastructure, well, that is nice to have this opinion as a private person, but not as a central bank governor, because for that, we have elected politicians and it should not be the function of the Reserve Bank to tell the government what to do. Same on climate change, same on indigenous economy. He may well hold his positions there, but they are not tasks for the central bank. So I think by the central bank engaging in all sorts of different areas that are not really connected to monetary policy, the Reserve Bank is becoming a political organization. And in doing so, I think it jeopardizes its own independence. So I think we've got a problem with the Reserve Bank, and I wish the Reserve Bank would just return to its original mandate, just price stability, nothing else.
Nice. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. So that is something that needs to be out there a lot more. I do think. I think that's a very strong point that you've just made there, and I think that's something that the mainstream media probably needs to pick up on a little bit more and dig a bit deeper. Tell me though, from the everyday investor's perspective, if we were looking at this, this health crisis, economic crisis, potentially an institutional crisis, what should we be doing as investors, right? Even as earners, right? Like if we're earning money in a fiat-based currency, there's risk there, right? Because that's our earning, that's how we transact. But it's also as a store of wealth. If all of our investments are denominated in a currency that can be eroded, it's not really that smart, is it? If we see something like this potentially unfolding. So what's a rational, mainstream, logical thing to do to protect what could potentially happen if things progress down that path?
Well, I'm not a licensed financial advisor, so I can only give you very generalized commentary from an economics perspective. What I would say is I'm relatively skeptical about cash in the long run because of all the reasons that we talked about earlier. I think we have a problem in central banking, we have a problem with the fiat currency, and I simply don't trust cash in the long run. And that means you have to find different investment classes. So I think you should actually go into something that is more concrete and limited in supply. So whether that is investment in gold or in real estate, or whether it's in individual companies, as long as it's tangible, as long as you can actually touch it, as long as it's not just completely virtual like cash, I think I would have more trust in these investments. And apart from that, the thing I would always say, but regardless of this crisis now, of course, you want to diversify, because the future is so uncertain these days. I mean, you look at the global policy uncertainty index, it is at record highs. I would actually spread my investments across different markets, different countries, different categories, between different investment vehicles. I mean, personally, I've got a combination between managed funds and ETFs, and the ETFs, again, spread across different industries. I think if you spread your risk, you probably minimize it. And it is especially true. It's not only true in crises, but I think especially true in crises when the future is as uncertain as it is.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's probably some really cool macro plays that you could do. Like you mentioned gold as well, and so I want to kind of pick your brain on that one a little bit. So in terms of using gold, investors typically view gold as almost like a zero coupon bond, or it's a hedge. But you mentioned physical gold before, and that kind of speaks to something else. So do you want to tell me what the rationale would be for owning physical gold in the context of, say, hyperinflation or something like that?
Well, I would probably tend more to that in a European context, where we can already see the first signs of financial repression happening. So that's when central banks start openly talking about maybe moving away from cash and maybe moving towards a fully digital currency, central bank currency. That's when I become nervous, because I think that central bankers somehow feel that the game is up, that they have reached the end of their normal monetary policy, and they would like to drive down interest rates even further. I mean, there are bank papers, ECB papers speculating on deeply negative interest rates. Now, you can forget about deeply negative interest rates as long as you still have cash, because people could just take it out and put it in a safe or hoard it under the mattress. Once we move away from cash and once we become fully digital, I mean, all options are open. And that is the kind of financial repression I was talking about, in which case it would be nice to have some safety in holding something physical, something that doesn't require a bank, something that doesn't require the ECB's approval. And I think these were traditionally, historically, the reasons why people wanted to hold physical gold. And we can see this already happening in Europe, and we can already see that some countries in Europe are starting to take restrictions on actually private holdings of gold. And we've been there before. When that kind of development happens, governments can be quite quick to say, no, but we won't allow any private person from holding gold anymore for exactly those reasons.
And that kind of happened in the US, didn't it? Where effectively it was illegal to hold physical gold, which is crazy for us to think about. And then that wasn't that long ago.
That's true. That's what happened. It happened because the government, of course, wanted to stop individual people from making rational decisions.
Interesting, isn't it? So, and you mentioned that with that phrase, capital control. So that's kind of in that category, right?
Yes, it is in that category. It's basically any policy by which governments and central banks would like to get more access, more oversight, more control over individual people's investment decisions. And they do that, of course, and they want to have that control because they want to be able to drive down interest rates where they want them to be without people having any way of escape.
Yeah. Okay. Recently in New Zealand, if you are a Bitcoin holder and you have bought Bitcoin from exchanges, you would have been notified that the IRD requested some information around how much have you bought, and even what was your IP address potentially. That there was quite a lot of information that they requested, and when firms get requests like that from the IRD, firms oblige. Whereas with physical gold, my understanding is that doesn't exist. So that's kind of one of the differences I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, but it is being introduced. I know that in some European countries they have started introducing some regulations around the purchase of physical gold. So you have to notify the government when you buy certain quantities. For the same reason, the European Central Bank has actually reduced the availability of banknotes in large denominations, because again, that just makes it easy for people to hold the money physically at home if they want to. So all of this makes me extremely nervous.
So tell me, again, on the topic of gold, we talked about how Nixon took the U.S. fully off the gold standard. I think it was in 1971 or something like that.
Yep, that's right.
Is there a potential solution here, though, with gold, or we'll call it hard money, right? where instead of debt forgiveness, instead of the whole system kind of exploding, is there going to be, or is there merits in returning potentially to some form of a gold standard, do you think?
Well, that's a discussion that I have in the office with our chief economist. We are both coming from the same background, roughly, where we would like to have less government control over money supply. I think that traditionally, over millennia, really, we've had some sort of link into precious metals, whether it's gold or silver. And basically, from the earliest forms of money in what is now modern Turkey, about 3000 BC, to 1971, to really Nixon moving off it, the world has had some sort of gold or silver standard. So that seems to be the thing that has historically happened. It doesn't mean, of course, we have to return to that. But if we want to get the government out of it, this is one option. And it's the most kind of tried and tested historical option. The other option would be to try free banking. The next option would be to use cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. But the end result would be always to take the money out of determining, the government out of determining the money supply. And that is the most important thing. And where that is not possible, at least we should have central banks with clear mandates, not mandates where we have to also fulfill some employment targets, as the RBNZ now has to, but really mandates for central banks just requiring them to stick to price stability.
Yeah.
By the way, then we have to discuss, of course, what we mean by price stability. From my perspective, it's not enough to just talk about the CPI, because we've seen what that does actually. Over the last few years, we've had all our inflation happening in assets, in stock markets, in real estate. So when you're just narrowly looking at the CPI, you're actually missing the inflation that's happening in the system.
And there, I guess the argument to that as well, it creates these feedback loops. So we can't really accommodate for too much of those things into this basket of goods. But I guess we're going into a new world where it's not a homogeneous basket, which indicates true inflation. It's quite heterogeneous, and there's quite a lot of different components. Assets aren't reflected in there. So are you saying basically that maybe one of the first steps is to actually redefine what the consumer price index is?
I would go further. I wouldn't just redefine what the consumer price index is. I would redefine what we mean by inflation. Okay. And from my Austrian economics perspective, inflation is money supply. We kind of separate the two. We say, the money supply can be wherever it wants to be as long as we got consumer price inflation under control. And I think once you accept that as your premise, you've already lost, because inflation is always the money supply, and then it materializes in all sorts of different ways. It can materialize in a CPI increase. It can materialize in the stock market, in real estate, or wherever you want it to be. Could be in old paintings, could be in vintage cars. So I think once we recognize that actually what we need to define as inflation is the money supply, you'll come to different conclusions.
I agree to that. Yeah. And I think there's some really good debates that you can watch online with Peter Schiff and I can't remember who the other guy was, but obviously one clearly from an Austrian school, one from a Keynesian school. And it's fascinating because those two almost polar opposites inform a lot of the debate out there. And we often have difficulty in lens shifting or holding two opposing views simultaneously. But I think that's kind of the art in this, because the answer might not be found at those polar extremes, but in the tension in between, right? What do you think on that in terms of solutions going forward? Is it going to be a new theory, or are we just going to migrate from one extreme to the other consistently?
Well, the thing is actually, as Friedrich Hayek said, you cannot take a truth for granted once and for all in economics. Every generation needs to discover and rediscover these fundamental truths about economics, including monetary economics. So the danger is not that a theory is disproven. The danger is just that a theory is forgotten. And I think we have, in the last few decades, forgotten what sound money actually means and why it's so important. And we have given way to a great degree of experimentation by central banks, and we'll regret that one day, and the day is probably not too far away. And then we'll have to return to the principles of sound money. And that could be a link to gold. It could be another form of limitation of the money supply. It could be just clearer targets and price stability targets for independent central banks. Because I think at the moment, our central banks are not as independent as they used to be. They have become very political organizations. Just look at the RBNZ, look at the ECB, and to a lesser degree, the Fed. And we have also confused central banks by giving them a variety of mandates. The ECB and the RBNZ both are talking about climate change a lot these days, as if that was their mandate. And similarly, they're talking about the indigenous economy and inclusion and inequality. None of this is the central bank's mandate. We need to go back to sound central banking, the kind of central banking that we had in New Zealand after the introduction of the Reserve Bank Act under Don Brash, or indeed the kind of central banking that we had at the beginning of the Federal Republic in Germany when the Bundesbank was established with the target of keeping money stable. So I think we just need to rediscover the old lessons of sound money and prudential monetary policy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Before we finish up though, Oliver, is there anything else that you want to, I guess, say to our audience in terms of what are some really prudent, rational things to be at least just watching? I know that you're not able or even qualified or in a position to give advice in any way, but what are some of the areas that we need to be looking at right now and understanding a little bit more of?
Personally, and it's got nothing to do with conventional investment advice, I would invest a lot more in the future of our children and in their education. This is the biggest investment that anyone can make in himself, but also for the benefit of their children. So if you want to have a good future, if you want your children to have a good future, you make sure that they are educated properly. The one big disappointment I have about New Zealand is the quality of the education system. I think we are wrecking the country, we're wrecking our young generation, we're wrecking our future productivity with that too, by having schools that don't teach properly anymore. That's a completely different podcast in itself, of course. But I think if you really care for your future wealth, if you care for your children's future wealth and income earning potential, you have to make up for the deficiencies of our education system. There are many ways you can do that. You can educate yourself, you can probably employ tutors, you can go to schools that don't teach according to the NCA system, maybe find a school that teaches according to the Cambridge certificate system, or send your children abroad. But invest in education. I think education still promises the biggest long-term returns to anyone actually enjoying a decent education.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Now, Oliver, if people want to find out more about what the NZ initiative is about and how to get involved, how to potentially become a member, where would you direct them to?
Just come to our website, nzinitiative.org.nz. There you find all our publications free of charge. You can subscribe to our newsletter, which you will enjoy. It's called Insights, comes out every Friday and provokes your thought. And it doesn't cost anything to subscribe. And if you want to become a member, we're a corporate membership organization, I have to say, so we don't have individual member categories. But if you're a company and you would like to support us, contact me directly and we'll see what we can do.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'll put some notes in the show notes as well so people can learn a little bit more as well. But thank you very much again. We'll hopefully catch up with you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Awesome. I hope you found that useful. Now, thanks very much, Oliver, for taking the time to meet with me today. Now, shortly after recording this episode, it's worth noting that the website Newsroom ran an expose on then NZ Initiative blog editor Nathan Smith, which found him to have published racist and misogynistic views on his own personal blog. Oliver has since described Smith's writing as abhorrent, and the organization is launching an independent investigation to ensure that the NZ Initiative's material hasn't been affected in any way. Today's recording happened before the Newsroom story, which is why you didn't hear it discussed. For me personally, I welcome thoughts and ideas from a broad spectrum. It's useful for creating thoughtful conversations and genuine insights as to how the world works, especially when it comes to investing. In fact, one of New Zealand's greatest strengths is its diversity in people and thought. Occasionally, though, and I'm sure this is true with others also, we have to make a call and say no to any comments from the far right that inspire hate and ignorance, just like I'd call out comments and actions from the far left that endorse more control and restrict freedom of speech. You can find more links to the Newsroom article and the NZ Initiative's response in the notes. So that's it from me for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode.